At this point, I want to just give a quick introduction to Charlie. He works out of Western Massachusetts as a freelance naturalist, and he's done work in many areas. So perhaps some of you have worked with him. I don't know. And he has over, I don't know, something like 40 publications related to this type of topic, where we're talking about insect and plant relationships. These are published documents that he's made significant scientific contributions about these topics. So we're thrilled to have him join us. He has lots more biographical information out there online. He's very talented. He has also published a wonderful guide to invertebrate tracks and signs, which is a published document that I encourage you to check out if you haven't seen it. And there is now an ebook as well about leaf miners, which is really quite extraordinary. So Charlie, feel free to talk more about all of your projects, because they're very interesting, and boost that biography a bit. But I'd like to turn it over to Charlie so we can talk directly to you all. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thanks, Sarah, for inviting me, and thanks everyone for tuning in. I won't give more of my biography just now, since we're already 10 minutes in, but native plants as insect habitat is the topic, and I'm specifically mostly going to be talking about herbivorous insects. And the reason native plants are important for herbivorous insects is each plant has its own set of defense chemicals that it's created to try to ward off herbivory. And for every plant, there's a suite of insects that have adapted to feed on those chemicals and tolerate them. So the longer there has been an association between a plant and a set of insects, the more insects there will be. So if you bring in a new plant like Japanese barberry or black swallowwort or something, there are going to be very few things that can feed on that. We've been staring at this patch of milkweed for over 10 minutes now, and probably most people, when they see that, are thinking of monarchs. And of course, with monarchs, it is not the adults, but the caterpillars that are associated, that are depending on the plant. And in a good year, a milkweed patch can be just covered with them. And there's this strange phenomenon sweeping the nation lately, where people are obsessed with monarchs and they want to kill everything else they see that's eating their milkweed plants. And that is, well, just unacceptable to me. I don't know I love monarchs. I don't know what is so special about them that you have to kill all these other neat bugs that also depend exclusively on milkweed. So you probably know milkweed, monarchs lay these single tiny eggs on the undersides of the leaves. So if you see caterpillars hatching out of a fuzzy egg mass like that, you're looking at something different. Those will grow up to be these little shag carpets, which are called milkweed tussock moths. That's what the adult looks like. And there are all kinds of non-caterpillar things feeding on milkweed. There are a lot of these in my yard right now. This is a milkweed longhorn beetle, and most longhorn beetles have wood-boring larvae, but the larvae of this group of beetles instead bore in the roots of milkweed plants. But the adults also feed on the leaves, and they have this special trick there's this milky latex in coursing through the veins of milkweed, and it gums up the mouth parts of anything that tries to eat it. But the longhorn beetles chew a little bit into the midrib that causes the latex to bubble out, and then they're free to munch on the tip of the leaf like that. So that's a characteristic sign of a milkweed longhorn beetle adult. This is a milkweed weevil, which has a similar trick. It's totally severed this midrib, and now it can eat all of this leaf tissue beyond the midrib there. And these weevils also chew holes in the stems and lay eggs there, and their larvae develop as stem borers, and they also, some of them will develop in the pods feeding on seeds instead. There are large milkweed bugs, which these are sucking on the pods, and there are also small milkweed bugs. This one's sucking on the flower buds. So every part of the plant gets used by something. And then these are leaf miners, which are, leaf miner is a general category for insects that feed between the epidermal layers of leaves. So they're actually living inside of the leaf. And there are flies, moths, beetles, and sawflies that are leaf miners. And since I've just spent the past 10 years writing a book about leaf miners, these will be a recurring theme in this slideshow. But on milkweed, there's a fly specific to milkweed. It's this little 2-millimeter fly that looks like that. But it's always the larvae that are doing the mining. So those are all things that feed on milkweed. But as I mentioned, every other native plant has its own suite of native bugs that are dependent on it. So I'm just going to go through a number of common plants, many of them that people would consider weeds. Most of them just showed up in my yard without me having to do anything other than not mow the lawn, which this is what our yard looked like when we bought our house 7 years ago or so. And the first thing we did was not mow the lawn and see what came up. And the very first wildflower that came up was a single daisy fleabane plant in the middle of the lawn there. So when I noticed it, I ran over to see what leaf miners were on it. And I ended up finding 3 different species on this one little plant. One was this, it starts with a linear mine that's actually on the lower surface first, but then it kind of moves into the middle tissue and makes this big puffy blotch. And I recognized that as the mine of this moth, Parectipa plantagenicella. But then there are also these linear mines, which I recognized as agromyzid fly mines, the same family as that last one we saw, but a totally different type of mine. And I raised this to see what would come out. And it turned out to be a species new to science that now has a name, Phytomyza erigeronis. So right in your own front yard, if you just stop mowing the lawn, you can discover new species. And then the third miner was this long track right along the midrib that looked very clean. And that turned out to be because this caterpillar inside was pushing all of its poop out a little hole at the other end and neatly piling it there. So I stuck this in a vial to see what it would turn out to be. And it was this moth that's in a very difficult group. It may also be a new species, but there's no one really working on this group right now. So it may be a wait before I will find out if this one has a name or not. Another plant that started popping up around the yards before long was evening primrose. There are several right along our driveway. And one day when I was on the way to get the mail, I spotted these striking pink and yellow moths just hanging out on the flowers. And I ran back inside and with the mail and Googled pink and yellow evening primrose moth and immediately learned that there's something called the primrose moth that has caterpillars that feed on evening primrose and specifically on the flower buds and fruits. So every day as I was getting the mail for the next couple of weeks, I was checking for signs of those caterpillars. And I finally, one day, saw this little caterpillar with its front end buried in a flower bud and yellow mush coming out the other end. And I looked around and saw some other signs of nibbled buds. And this is one where the fruit is already developing, but they've been feeding on the dead flower, so not doing any damage to the seeds. There's also an evening primrose leaf miner that makes this long, narrow, linear mine, little yellow-orange caterpillar inside. And a colleague in Illinois is working on a big revision of this moth genus, Mompha, and he asked me to collect some of these for him so he needed fresh specimens to do DNA analysis on. So I collected some to raise. When they're mature, these larvae pop out and spin cocoons, and the adults are have silvery patches with these little tufts. But when this moth emerged, here's the moth at the edge of the leaf. I noticed there were there was other feeding happening on the leaves. So I checked out the leaves to see what the source was. And it turned out these big holes were being made by two little poop covered larvae. Here's one of them there. There's a close up, you can't really, its face is in there somewhere. Before long, oh yeah, I have a side view. So there's its face and the poop piled on its back. Very charming. After a few more days of munching on the leaves, they spun these little cocoons. They scraped all the poop off their backs and incorporated it into their cocoons. And when they pupated, I saw that they were weevils. There's the little snout of the adult weevil on the pupa. And when the adults emerged, I recognized them as the species Dietziella zimmermanni, which is associated with the evening primrose family, but no one had ever found its larvae before. And then, oh yeah, and the adults also feed on the leaves, make smaller holes than the larvae do. But on that same leaf, here's that poop-covered weevil larva eating holes, but there's also what's called window feeding, where an insect is eating partway through the leaf, but leaving the opposite epidermis intact. And so that was a different insect doing that, and I found this to be the source of it. And this is a leaf beetle larva. I recognized it as being in that family, but didn't know exactly what it was. I knew that it wanted soil to burrow into to pupate, so I gave it that. It burrowed right down, and a few weeks later, this shiny gold flea beetle emerged, and this was a species that had been described just a decade earlier, and no one knew what its host plant was. So new discoveries to be made on common weeds along the driveway. And then also, that linear Mompha mine on the evening primrose was the only known eastern miner on evening primrose. So when I saw these blotch mines, and this one has two larvae all piling their brass in neat little piles at the other end, I knew I had something different. So I collected a bunch of those to see what they would turn into. They had darker red larvae that emerged and spun cocoons. And they were another species that was known from adults, but the immature stages had never been described, and its host plant wasn't known. That's Aristotelia isopelta for people keeping track of names. I'm mostly leaving names of things out of, I guess I don't have any text on the slides. Ragweed is a plant that most people who know what it is aren't excited to have it popping up in their yards, but there are a lot of insects that depend on it too. There's yet another leaf mining fly here, these little brown blotches at the edge, and the speckles, that white stippling is caused by the females using their ovipositors. Instead of laying eggs, they'll poke the leaf and make it bleed juice that they'll then drink from. It's called host feeding. It's a characteristic sign of female agromyzid flies. But the much more striking flies are these fruit flies that hang out on the ragweed, and the males will twist their fancy wings around to try to attract mates. And then the females lay eggs in the flowers or the developing fruits, and so their larvae are seed predators of ragweed. Nice to have around. There's also a stripy little leaf beetle that's dependent on ragweed. The adults and larvae both feed on the leaves. They lay these big clusters of eggs of fuzzy little larvae that spin their cocoons on the foliage, which is very unusual for beetles. Stinging nettle is another plant that most people aren't excited to have in their yard, although we love having it around because it's very nutritious and medicinal. An edible plant, the stinging hairs dissolve, or the stinging chemical goes away as soon as you cook it. It's high in protein and good for allergies and all kinds of other things. But there's a little clump of it growing right next to our front stoop. And I was sitting on the stoop one day and saw this egg on the underside of one of the leaves. This is an egg of a butterfly that eats only nettle leaves. They fold the leaves using silk, so the caterpillars are hiding when they're feeding. The chrysalis is also usually pretty concealed, but this one was exposed. And the adult it's a red admiral butterfly. Goldenrod, got clumps of that coming up all over our meadowy yard. This is a few years ago, but that's my face in there, so you can see how tall this goldenrod is. And I guess this was the spring before last, I noticed that a bunch of goldenrod stems had been neatly cut off, maybe 8 inches high. And I saw that there was this tightly packed pulverized wood inside. So I took a knife and cut it one of these lengthwise to see what was going on. And there's this narrow frass-packed gallery that went right down to the ground level. So I realized to find out who was doing this, I'd have to dig up a clump of sod and stick it in a trash bag in the front hallway. So that's what I did. And I got, over the next month, I got like 35 different species of insects emerging from this little cubic foot of my lawn, which I wrote a whole blog post that shows all of those bugs. But finally, the bug that was actually cutting off the stems emerged. It was this plume moth. That's the face of the plume moth looking through the rearing vial at you. A very conspicuous sign of insects on goldenrod, which these are showing up in my yard right now. This is called the goldenrod ball gall. So a gall is a plant, that's G-A-L-L. Some people think it sounds like I'm saying G-U-L-L, but a gall is a plant deformity caused by, in this case, an insect, but sometimes other organisms, in some way manipulating the plant. So sometimes it's a sort of genetic engineering, sometimes it's a mechanical stipulation or chemical, or maybe a mixture of all three. But it tricks the plant into making this shelter around its developing offspring, and it provides all the food and shelter they need to complete their development. In this case, it's a fruit fly, the same family as those ragweed flies I just showed. And in the winter, the woodpeckers and chickadees, in this case, downy woodpeckers, know where to find the larva in the gall. And when the larva is done feeding, because the adult fly doesn't have chewing mouth parts, it needs another way to get out of the gall. So the larva chews this little tunnel to just under the skin of the gall, and then it pupates there. And in the spring, this balloon puffs out of the forehead of the fly and busts open a little door on the gall. This is one with its airbag has deflated, but it's still working its way out of the gall. And then, and all of the flies, the so-called higher flies, the ones that have a body plan like a housefly rather than a mosquito, do this same thing. They form a puparium, which is the hardened skin of the last instar larva around its pupa. And then they have this structure called a tilinum that puffs out of their forehead. And then once they're out, it recedes into this suture in their face and never comes out again for the rest of their life. It's just a really bizarre strategy. But these adult gall flies are about the size of deer flies. This is one right next to the hole it's squeezed out of. And they kind of have patterned wings like deer flies too, but they have this telescoping ovipositor for inserting their eggs in the stems. They're fairly similar galls, but more elongate, that you can distinguish from the fly galls by this little brown circle at the top. This is where the caterpillar inside has pre-made an exit hole for the adult moth and then plugged it with frass. That's the adult of I think it's called the elliptical goldenrod gall moth or something like that. There are also a whole bunch of midges, which are little mosquito-like flies that form different types of galls on goldenrods. And these rosette galls, these bunchy clusters of leaves at the tops of stems. Pretty much every goldenrod has a different species of midge making a similar gall on it. This is one that I first found on Nantucket, but later in a few places along the Maine coast on seaside goldenrod, which there was a woman in Israel working on a revision of this genus of goldenrod gall midges, and she determined that this is an undescribed species, but more work is needed to conclude. The DNA shows that it's a distinct species, but she wasn't able to find quite enough morphological evidence to name it as its own species yet. But stay tuned on that one. But when I was doing some work for the Maine Coast Heritage Trust a few years ago, I collected a little bag of those skulls and took some apart, and you can see that inside there are these little cells deep in those rosettes of leaves that contain a larva and this symbiotic fungus that lines the cell. And I think they may partly feed on that fungus. In some cases, gall midges have a symbiotic fungus that just forms a physical barrier that makes it harder for parasites to get in. But in any case, there's always that fungus inside the cells of these larvae. And eventually some of these pupae rattled out of the galls in the bag, and I got to watch the midge emerge from this one. So there's the tip of its thorax and its head popping out. It's juggling its empty pupa. So that's the adult Asphodylea species that makes the seaside goldenrod gulls. On goldenrods and asters, there are a whole bunch of different caterpillars that depend on these plants. This one, I don't know too much about it other than it's a really beautiful caterpillar. It's called the brown hooded owlet moth. The adult is a little less exciting, but still okay. Also on both goldenrods and asters are in the same tribe of the aster family, so they share a lot of insects. This is something you can find on both of them, and that there are actually at least two different unrelated moths that make a similar shelter where they tuck leaves into each other, tie them together with silk, and there's this silken runway running all down the middle of this thing. But I stuck this one in a jar and discovered that this caterpillar was inside, and eventually emerged as this dichomerous moth. The other caterpillar that does this, I don't know if anyone has figured out what it is yet, but it's white with black speckles on it, and it's been found in Iowa. I don't know about anywhere else, but someone in Iowa should work on rearing that one. And then I'm mostly talking about ubiquitous plants here, but the more obscure plants will have usually a smaller number of bugs that depend on them, but still interesting ones. So this is a little wetland mint called Mad Dog Skullcap. This was something I bumped into at work one day. I was doing botanical surveys in wetlands all over Massachusetts, and I saw this rolled leaf, and I thought, I haven't really noticed something rolling leaves of Mad Dog Skullcap before, so I'll stick that in a vial and see what it turns into. And this moth came out that I've, with a little Googling, figured out is called the skullcap skeletonizer moth. So that they'll feed on different kinds of skullcaps, but only on skullcaps, the genus Scutellaria. So that concludes the herbaceous plant portion. I'll talk about a few shrubs and vines now. This is a wild grapevine that volunteered along our driveway, and it's, you can see sort of some of the leaves are riddled with holes of Japanese beetles, which are definitely not a host-specific insect. They'll feed on all kinds of things, but a fairly distinctive feeding sign where they riddle leaves with these ragged holes. But I noticed this one leaf had something different going on, just something munching on the edge, and I flipped it over and found this lovely little caterpillar on the underside, and I just a few leaves over found an older caterpillar of the same species, and these are larvae of the beautiful wood nymph moth, which Kind of looks like bird poop, but is also beautiful at the same time. I don't know how it pulls that off.
Hey, Charlie, I'm going to interrupt you for just a moment. Somebody's asked if you could speak up a little bit, so that's one request. Mostly, I think people are able to hear, but that'd be great if that's feasible. And we've had a couple of questions from a while ago in the program. So, and I didn't stop Charlie. So we're going to go back to those towards the end. So just to let participants know, we'll go back to the early questions. We haven't had any questions just recently, so I'll let you keep going at this point, and then we'll circle back.
All right. So I've alluded a few times to, or showed a few things that tie leaves, but I didn't really explain how that works. So silk, insect silk has this property where it contracts as it dries. So an insect is able to roll a leaf by laying down little bands of silk, and as it dries, it pulls the leaf inward, and then they add some more little bands of silk, and they keep doing that until they end up, in this case, with a cigar-shaped roll of a grape leaf. Some leaf rollers are more generalists, so I tend not to be as interested in them as leaf miners, but this particular one is a grape and Virginia creeper specialist called the grape leaf roller moth. The larvae are plain, kind of whitish when they're younger. They turn green with these black speckles when they're older, and a lot of Microlepidoptera turn red when they're getting ready to pupate. And that's what the adults look like. May have seen them at your porch light at some point. That's where I saw this one. There's a set of leaf miners that are specialists on grape and Virginia creeper. This family, Heliozelidae, is known as the shield bearer moths because when they're done feeding, they cut out this little hole punch, which they wear. They're still between the two epidermises, so wearing this leaf piece like a shield, and they'll drop down, there's an invisible strand of silk up here that this caterpillar is poking its head out of and lowering itself down from a grapevine in a tree over my driveway. It was very hard to focus on that while it was waving in the breeze, but eventually they land and will attach that little leaf piece to some substrate, and that becomes their cocoon. Here its head is tucked back in like a turtle. And the adults look like that. These are currently placed in the genus Antispola, but there's a paper that is in press right now that will split this off from Antispola. The ones with little silver spots in the back are in a new genus whose name I can't utter until it's published. But there's one species in this family, the Heliozelidae, that instead of being a leaf miner, it makes galls along the veins, just these lumpy things. But it still, when it's mature, cuts out a little piece that it makes its cocoon out of. It's not as neat looking a cocoon, it's just this irregular cylinder of frass and silk and leaf bits. But it wanders off and hides itself in the debris. I don't have a picture of the adult of this one yet, but I've got some I'm trying to raise. So maybe next year I'll have some adults.
Charlie, one of our participants is asking, what's the difference between leaf mining and window? Is it the same?
A leaf miner is inside the leaf. It's living between the two epidermal layers, and window feeding is eating on the outside, eating everything except the opposite epidermis. So if the larva is there, you'll see it sitting on the surface, as opposed to a leaf miner. You flip the leaf over, and if you hold it up to the light, you can see the larva inside, but it's not on the surface.
And another person asked, what time of day are the caterpillars most observable?
Oh, geez. Well, that depends on which caterpillars. Do you know which they were asking that about?
It doesn't say specifically, but it was a recent question.
It varies. But a lot of caterpillars will just hide on the undersides of leaves when they're not feeding. Yeah, so if you investigate, you can generally find find them at any time of day, although there are some things that will go down and hide in leaf litter during the day or in sand or something and then come up and feed. So very hard to generalize. But.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. There are also a bunch of midge galls on grapes. I did a blog post about this species several years ago, and I periodically get people commenting and asking, how can I get rid of this? And it's killing my grapevine. I don't know, we have this on our grapevines. We get lots of grapes. I don't know what the problem is, but these fleshy galls can be on the leaves or on the tendrils or on the stems. They're little orange larvae inside that hopefully your screen, you can move the little, I have a window where all of the panelists are on the side, so you can't see the little face of the larva there, but it's way over on the right side, just a little pointy head. But these pop out of the galls when they're mature and they burrow into soil. And then some adults will emerge, they're still orange, a few weeks later, and some not until the following year. And this is the genus Vitus Siela, named after the host genus Vitus of grape. But there's another, let's see, they just renamed this genus, it's Ampelomyia, that make more complex detachable galls on grapes. This one has the species name Vitus coralloides, which means grape hazelnut, little cluster of hazelnuts on the grape stem. This one is Vitus pomum, like a grape apple or grapefruit. And then there are these little thorn-like ones that drop off. These are former attachment points of these galls. And then I think all of these Ampelomyia species pupate inside their galls. And so the adult emerges directly from the gall. All right, moving on from vines to shrubs. This is Spicebush, which is something that did not come up in our yard on its own, but we planted a couple right along the side of the house. And when you start seeing folded leaves like that on Spicebush, there's a specific caterpillar that's a sign of. If you unfold the leaf, you'll see this caterpillar with big fake eyes on its back. Its actual head is up there or here. And this is doing a different kind of leaf folding than the things I've talked about so far. Rather than making little bands of silk, it makes this fine bed of silk covering the whole leaf, and it just folds neatly in half as it dries and contracts. There's a leaf that the caterpillar has left, but you can still see the silk in it. So these, rather than eating the leaf that they're living in, they'll just return to this fold and they'll munch other leaves nearby. The young caterpillars look like bird poop. This is a recurring theme. And the adults, they're Spicebush swallowtails. And there was one year that they completely defoliated our Spicebushes, and the plants were totally fine the next year. You can, another characteristic leaf shelter, you can see even through the winter on Spicebush, these are staying attached because the caterpillar has wrapped the leaf stalk with silk, so it's still attached to the twig. You can see the silk running all along there and down the petiole. And this is the cocoon of the Promethea moth, which is also known as the Spicebush silk moth. Witch hazel is a neat plant to have around because the flowers bloom in November when there's hardly anything else blooming, and the fruits take until like the following October to ripen, and then they spit their seeds out. I've only witnessed it once, but they shoot like 20 feet from the pods. There are a couple of neat galls you can see on witch hazel. If you weren't familiar with witch hazel fruits, you might think this was the fruit, but this is the actual fruit of a witch hazel, and this is one of the galls on the left there. This is caused by an aphid, which most aphids have this complex life cycle where all through the summer, they're living on one host plant, and there are only females that just give birth to live young. And then in the fall, suddenly there are males and females, and they have wings, and they'll mate, and the females fly to a totally unrelated host plant and lay eggs on that, and the eggs overwinter, and then in the spring, the nymphs will feed on that plant before migrating back to the summer host. So in the case of these witch hazel gall aphids, the witch hazel is their summer host, and birch is their winter and spring host. So the spring generation of these witch hazel, spiky witch hazel gall aphids will make these corrugations on birch leaves. On the undersides of those corrugations, you'll see all these little aphid nymphs tucked in there, covered with little waxy fluff that they're secreting. And there's another kind of aphid gall on witch hazel, which looks like a little witch hat poking up out of the leaf. This species also moves to birch for the winter. And this is, I opened up a gall and found an adult aphid inside, about ready to come out. But normally how they get out of the gall is like flies, they don't have chewing mouth parts, so they need to engineer the plant to create this little mouth that opens in the underside of the gall. So pretty much all aphid galls will have this slit in them that opens when their adults are ripe and ready to come out. Witch hazel also has a leaf roller, and here you can see the bands of silk I was talking about. And each one of those bands is made of hundreds and hundreds of little strands of silk. If you watch a caterpillar doing this, it has labial silk glands, so it's whipping its head back and forth over and over to tie the strands to either side of that band. And if you open up a leaf roll, you can find unexpected things inside. So this is the caterpillar that made the roll, but there's also this much smaller caterpillar, and then a third caterpillar that's made a cocoon. And there are some people who have spent their whole careers investigating leaf rolling caterpillars as ecosystem engineers. They create these little microhabitats that other insects and mites and springtails can live in, and they feed on the detritus inside after the caterpillars are gone, or sometimes while they're still there. This is another one that turns bright red when it's mature, and it makes this neat little pupil shelter where it cuts out an oval and folds it over, and then this is where the pupa has popped out for the adult to emerge. Very beautiful little moth that is called the Sumac leaf roller moth or leaf tire moth, something like that. And for whatever reason, this one feeds on both witch hazel and sumac, which are not really related. But that's its role on a sumac leaflet. Sumac is another shrub that most people consider weeds, I think, but they're nice to have around. They, these fuzzy red berries, in addition to making a nice lemonade-like drink, they stay on all winter and even into late spring, and robins and bluebirds and other birds will come and feed on the berries all throughout the winter and spring, and all the bugs that are living in the fruit clusters. There's also an aphid gall on sumac, which can be quite prolific sometimes, and they sometimes look like little apples coming out of the sumac leaves. If you open them up, they're just chock full of these aphids. And this one, I had to look it up to find out what its deal was, but it, for the winter, it migrates to mosses, and it lays eggs on mosses, and then the nymphs feed on those in the spring. And that just seems extra bizarre to me that there's an aphid that feeds on moss. But that's just the witch hazel aphid again as a placeholder, because I don't have a picture of that one as an adult. Another neat thing about sumac is it has a pithy center, so we cut a bunch of sumac stems from the edge of our yard to use them as stakes in our pea trellis. And then I was remembering how little solitary bees will bore into that pithy center to make their nests. So I checked one day, and every single one of them had a little hole in the top. There's a pea flower. And you can just barely see there's a little shiny green guy in there, but this is one that the next spring, so we had piled all our stakes at the edge of the garden, and I split some open to see what was in there, and there were bees that had overwintered inside the nests. So this is a view of the whole nest in there. But some of these had the bees, and others had jumping spiders living in them, and others there was one that a sawfly larva had crawled into to spin its cocoon. So they're creating little microhabitats for all kinds of other things. And these are called small carpenter bees, in the same family as the big carpenter bees, but not closely related to them. This is one resting on a bloodroot flower, so they come out in early spring. Dogwood, another good shrub. I've mentioned sawflies a few times. A lot of people are unfamiliar with sawflies. These are in the order Hymenoptera, so related to bees, ants, and wasps, but they have vegetarian caterpillar-like larvae. And the ones on dogwood are covered with this white waxy stuff. Each time they molt, they have to secrete it again. But so this one has a light coating, but they get a really dense covering of wax. And, then the pre-pupae, which are mobile larvae that are ready to pupate, go wandering off, and they don't have a waxy covering. And I didn't know what they needed to pupate, and I was keeping some in a little Ziploc bag by my desk one time, and I was sitting at my computer, and all of a sudden, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed this movement 20 feet away on the other side of the room, and I went and looked, and there was one of these larvae had chewed out of the bag, and it was trying to bore into the windowsill. And it turns out this particular kind of sawfly larva needs punky wood to bore into to pupate. There was a wooden chair on the way to the window, and I found a little pile of sawdust where it had tried that out, but it had found it too hard. So sawflies can be tricky to rear for sure. But this is the adult of the dogwood sawfly. It kind of looks like an ichneumon wasp. Arrowwood, another shrub with big bunches of flowers that attract all kinds of pollinating insects. For the past decade, my wife and I have been doing a survey of the leaf miners and gall makers of Nantucket. And there was one known leaf miner on Arrowwood viburnum, which is this one, a moth that makes what are called underside tentiform mines, where it starts out making these flat mines on the lower leaf surface. There's a larva you can see there and there. So this is 3 different mines. And then when it gets to a certain age, it starts spinning silk inside and develops different mouth parts. So it ends up making this little tent as the silk dries and contracts. It buckles the leaf, and they eat all the way through the leaf tissue. So a full depth mine. This is the lower and upper surface of the same mine. And this is a pupil skin poking out at one end where the adult moth has already popped out. That's this little 3 millimeter moth, Philoneuricter viburnella. So that was the only known leaf miner on viburnum. So when we found this, we knew it was something, something else. And it took us 5 years to piece together the story of this moth. And I won't go into all the details of how that went, but it turns out that in July, the egg is laid right there in this case, and the larva starts out squiggling around the leaf, but then goes down the midrib and petiole. This is what the larva looks like at that stage. It then spends almost the next year feeding as a stem miner, in some cases making a externally visible stem mine, but often deeper in the tissues. And then it cuts out this little bark flap at the end of its mine and spins its cocoon under that, which is decorated with these little frothy bubbles, which are anal secretions, and no one really knows what purpose they serve. But once we figured out that that's what they were doing, we spent several hours one June looking for these little flaps and collecting them. We got about 30 of them and had 3 adult moths emerge, and they were an undescribed species, which is now named Marmora viburnella. But this genus Marmora has dozens of undescribed species, about 20 described species, and most of them are stem miners. A few of them are leaf miners. And there's one, if you buy organic oranges, you might find mines of one species in the peels of the oranges.
Charlie, one of our participants is asking if you could describe some of the methods of collecting and hatching in a vial, because it sounds like something that would be interesting to do at home.
Yeah, I have a page on my website that details my process for doing that. Maybe I can go into that a little more at the end. I've got
that sounds great, and we'll share that website link with participants later too.
Great. And somewhere in the course of trying to figure out what that viburnum miner was doing, I stuck big sprigs of arrowwood in a gallon Ziploc bag, and a couple of weeks later there were 2 of these big caterpillars in there that must have been eggs when I collected them. I knew they were sphinx moths of some sort because they have this horn on the end, so related to the tomato and tobacco hornworms. With the big caterpillars like this, you often don't have to raise them to find out what they are, because people have already studied the charismatic megafauna. So I just looked in Dave Wagner's Caterpillars of Eastern North America guide, and he has a host plant index, and I found that the sphinx moth that feeds on viburnums is the hummingbird clearwing, which I was certainly familiar with the adults, but had never found the caterpillars before. Meadowsweet. This is a shrub that has just shown up on its own in our yard, and it's a welcome arrival for sure. This is going to be the one part where I talk about flower visitors rather than just herbivorous things. But at first I'll mention one herbivorous thing that I found on Meadowsweet. This is another leaf miner that starts out making a little underside tentiform mine, but then it walks across the leaf, pops out of its mine, and then it feeds externally under a little flap. And that's characteristic of the genus Perornix. And when I found this on a meadowsweet under the power lines near our house, and this moth emerged, and it's a species that was described from British Columbia about 100 years ago, and there are no further records of it. So I have no idea if it occurs all across North America or if it somehow was transported here or what. We need more people out looking for tiny moths, I guess. But when the meadowsweet is in bloom, the flowers are covered with all kinds of different insects. And my wife and I spent maybe half an hour one day just taking pictures of as many different bugs as we could on this one meadowsweet plant. And when people talk about planting for pollinators, they often just talk about plants that make flowers that bugs visit, but in all cases, that's just the adult insects that are visiting the flowers, and they all have a whole other life that requires other things for them to complete their life cycle. So you need to think about the whole picture to actually be providing habitat for them. So this is a mining bee in the genus Andrena. They need exposed sandy soil they make their nests in the ground. In sandy places, and they dig these little holes and provision their tunnels with balls of pollen and nectar and lay eggs on them, and that's how their larvae develop. This is a yellow-faced bee, which does it also. All solitary bees, so the bees other than honeybees and bumblebees, do the same thing where they make a little ball of pollen and nectar and put it in their nest. But these yellow-faced bees nest in tunnels, and I've seen them peeking out of raspberry stems that have previously been nested in by those small carpenter bees. I don't think these make their own tunnels. This is a dance fly. They are predatory as well as visiting flowers, and their larvae some are predators and some just feed on detritus, but they're mostly found in decaying leaf litter. So if all you have is a lawn and there's no nice leaf litter and rotting stuff around the edges, you won't have dance flies around. This is a square-headed wasp. So, all of the solitary wasps, so the ones that aren't parasitic on other insects and the ones that aren't, don't have communal nests like the paper wasps and the bald-faced hornets and things like that, they all have a particular insect that they hunt and they sting to paralyze it, and then they stuff a bunch of those paralyzed insects into their nest and lay eggs on it, and that's how they provision for their young. So this particular square-headed wasp hunts flies and stuffs them in a hollow stem somewhere, maybe a hollow stem that was hollowed out by a small carpenter bee. And then this is a parasitic wasp that parasitizes, or it lays its eggs in the nests of other wasps like that one I just showed. So very complex relationships here, all on this one meadowsweet plant. This is a scarab beetle whose larvae live in rotting wood. So if you're clearing all of the brush and logs and things off your property, you won't have, there are all kinds of insects that are being eliminated from the picture. Another example being the longhorned beetles. People are familiar with the Asian longhorn beetle, which attacks healthy trees, but there are 1,000 or more species of longhorn beetles, and most of them bore in already compromised wood. And then their galleries are used by all sorts of other insects like solitary bees, or like this mason wasp, which paralyzes caterpillars and then stuffs them in pre-existing cavities like longhorn beetle burrows. And then there are insects with herbivorous larvae that visit flowers too. So this is an adult sawfly in the family Argidae, which includes this species, which makes this really neat sinusoidal cut into cherry leaves in the spring. And we found these on Nantucket, and although they weren't leaf miners, it was a distinctive enough pattern that my curiosity was piqued and I wanted to rear it out to see what it was. As it got older, it started branching out and making a less distinct pattern, and ultimately they were just feeding on the edge like other sawflies do, bonking heads there. And most sawflies will burrow into soil to pupate, which is what most of these did, but this particular one spun its cocoon on the surface so I could get a picture of it. And most sawflies have a single generation per year. So this was in June and I had to save it until the following spring before the adult would emerge. And this was a species that Dave Smith, the North American or American sawfly expert, had described in 1968 or something, and it was known to feed on cherry, but that little sinusoidal pattern the young larvae made hadn't been described really. And while I was raising those cherry feeding sawflies, I noticed this other little guy in the same vial, so I separated it into its own vial to see who that would turn out to be. It was an inchworm, just eating little clusters of holes. So every plant feeding insect has its own feeding pattern. And if you really get to know one plant, you can learn who all the different characters are just by the signs they leave. As this got bigger, it developed this fancy face pattern. It burrowed into soil like the sawfly larvae, and likewise didn't emerge until the following spring, when it revealed itself to be the white spring moth, the blandest of all moths, but kind of nice anyway. There's another kind of inchworm that feeds on cherry. This one is the only gregarious inchworm, at least in eastern North America. So rather than having solitary larvae, a whole bunch of them feed together in the tips of cherry leaves and tie them together. That might look kind of ugly, but inside there are these beautiful caterpillars and turn into even more beautiful moths as adults. This is called the cherry scallop shell moth. A more subtle feeding sign on cherry leaves, this little snowflake pattern. If you flip over the leaf, you've got lace bugs sucking on the underside and causing that white stippling. And they lay these neat little clusters of eggs that are kind of shaped like bowling pins glued down with this tar-like substance to the underside of the leaf. And they're called lace bugs because of this beautiful lacy pattern. This is another thing that people generally think of as pests, but I think they don't cause very much harm, and they're pretty neat looking. And every plant I'm talking about, and pretty much every other plant, has leaf miners on it. I've been sparing you leaf miners for the most part here, but just one that's on cherry is another one of these shield bearer moths, like I showed on Virginia creeper earlier. Each one of these was made by a different larva, which cut out its pupil case. And that I didn't show before how they actually attach their pupil cases, but they use this little button of silk to attach it at one end. And the adult moth is just about 2 millimeters long. Coptodisca splendoriferella is the name of that one. It can also be found on related rosaceous trees and shrubs like apple, maybe hawthorn.
Charlie, one of our attendees is asking, when you say cherry, are you referring to all native cherries, or was there something?
Yeah, that was, all of those examples I just showed were on black cherries specifically, but you could, a lot of insects are specific to a plant genus rather than one species. Now, some will be just on one species, and some are on a tribe of plants or a family of plants. So there's the host specificity varies, but most of those things I just showed you would see on other prunus species.
Thank you.
So I'm moving on to sugar maple here with another hole punching insect, but this one, although just the first instar larva is a leaf miner, but after that it cuts out this little leaf piece and it flips it over, and it ties that down. This is what an older one has done, but it stitches it down with silk, and you can see where it's eating some holes right around the edges. But it'll periodically, as it grows, it flips over its case again and cuts out a bigger leaf piece and feeds under that. So very distinctive way of being. This is one that's in the process of cutting out its next larger piece, and these are some rings made from its previous feeding adventures. And so this is where one cut out a hole there and it tied its leaf piece down several different places, and it's currently feeding right there. And eventually it will pupate within that case in the leaf litter, and the adult emerges the following spring. This is the pupil case sticking out in the adult moth. A beautiful little iridescent blue moth with an orange head called the maple leafcutter moth. Although this one, if there aren't sugar maples around, you can find it on some weird things like huckleberry and blueberry. And in Alberta, people have found it on shadbush. So not totally host specific, but definitely prefers sugar maple. When you see little bunches, this is not quite leaf folding, not quite leaf rolling, but it's known as leaf crumpling when there's silk tied like that and it just kind of bunches up irregularly. But when you see that on sugar maple, if you open it up, there's this neat little structure inside, this poop cornucopia. That's where this caterpillar has tied all of its frass together, and it's living inside that, and it makes little forays out to window feed inside that shelter. That's called the maple trumpet skeletonizer moth because it lives in that little trumpet and skeletonizes the leaf. And all sorts of other caterpillars on maples. This was a red maple with caterpillars just hatching out. These are larvae of the rosy maple moth, which is always a treat to see at a light, or occasionally I've found them just walking around on the ground in the woods. Adorable little fuzzy faces. On some other trees, there are some caterpillars with just neat specializations, adaptations to their particular plant. So this is the double-toothed prominent caterpillar, and it has this serrated back that perfectly matches the leaf serration. So when it's feeding on the leaf, it's harder for a bird to pick it out. It's actually called the double-toothed prominent, although it has doubly serrated projections on its back. It has 2 teeth on the wing of the adult as well. And then on sycamore, there's this little caterpillar that doesn't have a common name, but it harvests the fuzz from the underside of the leaf, the little trichomes, and piles them up and lives in that little shelter, and then it eats around that. This is another little cylinder of fuzz. And the adult, it's a Gellichiid moth. So that this family is known as the twirler moths because a lot of the adults kind of twirl around when they're sitting on a leaf. All right, oaks. There are probably more insects that feed on oaks than on anything else. And that's certainly true of caterpillars, it's true of leaf miners, but something that's kind of unique to oaks is the gall wasps. I mean, there are gall wasps on a few other plants, but the vast majority are on oaks, and there are 1,000 or so species in North America, and each species induces a particular form of gall on a particular part of a particular kind of oak, or maybe a few closely related oaks, but I don't think there are any species that feed on oaks in both the white oak group and the red oak group. They're all more specialized than that. They all have this kind of humpbacked appearance. They insert eggs into whatever tissue their galls are going to develop in. And there's just amazing diversity in these galls. So there are these faceted ones that are on the veins of white oaks. This is another one in the same genus that always has little spines on the facets. It's called the hedgehog gall wasp. There are other kind of saucer-shaped ones on the undersides of white oak leaves. Most of these are detachable and they'll drop off and the adults will emerge later just from the leaf litter. These spherical fuzzy balls on white oaks, big clusters of tiny fuzz balls on white oaks. There are some that are more integrated into the tissue, so not detachable, swellings in the petioles and midribs. This is one that can be in different kinds of tissue, either the catkins or the leaves, but there's always this free rolling cell inside. It's called the roly-poly gall because of that. So if a parasite is trying to stick its ovipositor into that gall, it's going to be hard to get at that thing as it's rolling around. It's ingenious. I don't know how they come up with this stuff. And then there are others that are called oak apple galls that are formed from leaf tissue. These are coming right out of the buds, so the entire leaf has been consumed by this gall. This pointy kind is only found on scrub oak, the Quercus ilicifolia, but there are spherical oak apples on various other oaks. This is the woolly catkin gall wasp. So this fuzzball is attached to a catkin. And I didn't mention before, but many gall wasps, like aphids, have a two-part life cycle where they make one kind of gall in the spring and another kind in the fall. And there are probably most species we haven't yet figured out the whole life cycle. But this is the first one where its whole life cycle was figured out. So in the spring, it makes this gall on catkins, but in the fall, it makes this gall attached to developing acorns that secretes honeydew. So somehow they engineer an oak to make sweet, sticky sap. Mind-blowing, but the reason they do that, or the advantage to doing that, is that it attracts mean things like ants and yellow jackets who come and drink the sap, and that's incidentally guarding the gall from parasitoids. And this is the one thing in this whole slideshow that can't be found in New England. This was a gall in California, but I'm including it because it shows this pterimid wasp inserting eggs into a gall. So this is its ovipositor sheath here, and its actual ovipositor is this hypodermic needle sticking straight down into the gall. So in this series, you can see it plunging that needle deep into the gall to find the larvae to lay eggs on or in. There are some, I mentioned oak apple galls are formed from leaf tissue, but these ones that seem very apple-like when you cut them open are actually formed on the sides of acorn caps. I had never seen one in situ until last fall on Nantucket. We found this one with 3 all coming out of one scrub oak cap. And then there are some that are just stem swellings at the tip, always at the tip, and the buds will still be viable. So you get these characteristic deformities the next year when new growth comes out. There are galls, detachable galls on twigs, like these bullet galls that are only on white oaks, and the banded bullet galls only on red oaks. All right, so that's it for the gall litany. This is another characteristic thing you can see on oaks, but it's not a gall. This is something that rather being made by the plant, it's actively made by the insect. Specifically a leaf rolling weevil, which rather than using silk, it makes these two curving cuts that meet in the middle on an oak leaf. And then it, without using any silk or other adhesive, it just uses basically origami to make this neat little cylinder that it's tucking pieces in here and there, and it has laid its egg in the middle, and the larva does all its feeding just on the tissue inside that leaf roll. And there's one kind related weevil that's called the thief weevil that will lay its eggs in rolls already made by other weevils, and then the thief weevil larva eats the egg and gets to eat all the tissue that this mother weevil has done all the work creating.
Charlie, one of our participants asked, what is so different about white, red, black oaks that insects rarely cross the line?
They're just different evolutionary lineages. They're actually placed in different subgenera. So it's kind of basically any line we draw above species is arbitrary. So we could call I think Leucobalanus is the subgenus of the white oaks. If you considered that a genus, then it would make more sense that all these things are only on white oaks. But yeah, it's just more closely related groups that the insects see the lines a little bit differently than the taxonomists do, I guess.
Are there advantages maybe to some insects being specialists in that regard?
Certainly the advantages to everybody as a whole community is if most things are very specialized, then they're not bumping into each other as much. And within a plant, you'll have things making galls on different parts of the plant, or leaf miners feeding on different parts of the leaf or at different times of year. So there's all kinds of niche partitioning going on that reduces conflict.
Thank you.
And as I mentioned, there are more leaf miners on oak, on Quercus than on any other genus in North America. My key to oak leaf miners has, I forget, something like 120 couplets in it, but some of them just end in a list of things that you can't tell apart by the mind. So there's probably somewhere between 150 and 200 species of leaf miners on oaks, but I'll just show you one. This family Areocraniidae just comes out. It's a moth that comes out first thing in the spring when the oak leaves are still expanding, and they insert their eggs, causing a little hole to open up as the leaf tissue keeps expanding. The Areocraniid larvae have these, when they get older, have this characteristic stringy, squiggly frass they make, and they'll just feed for about a week or so, and then the larvae pop out and drop to the soil and burrow in and don't emerge as adults until the following spring. But it's worth the wait because they're these dazzling little purple iridescent things. The common name for the family is the sparkling archaic sun moths, because they're archaic. They're one of the most primitive lineages of moths, and they're sun moths because they're day flying, although I've never seen them in the day. And this particular species had been described from a few adults caught in Ithaca, New York in 1978, and then we found the larvae mining leaves on Nantucket, but its host and mature stages hadn't been described before.
And Charlie, a couple people have asked, what's the importance of leaf miners in the food web, and what eats a leaf miner?
I could do a whole talk on that, but there are all kinds of parasitoid wasps, these little tiny wasps that live inside of leaf miners, or maybe on the outside, but within the leaf mine. There's a whole chapter in my book that's probably 150 pages long or so that goes through all the different groups of those, and some of them are most of the ones that feed on leaf miners feed exclusively on leaf miners, and some will exclusively feed on one, one genus of leaf miner, or just on leaf mining flies, or just on leaf miners that feed on grass-like plants. They have different kinds of specializations. Beyond that, there are some of those mason wasps that hunt that hunt caterpillars. There are some that specialize in leaf mining larvae, and then all sorts of other things like predatory stink bugs and lace bug larvae will pierce into leaf mines and suck the juices out of the larvae. And ants will chew leaf miners out and carry them off to their nests. And then birds like chickadees know about leaf mines, and they'll open them up and eat the larvae. And then of course, all of these tiny bugs are eaten by bigger bugs. And so they're kind of at the base of the food web if you ignore the plants.
Yeah, pretty extraordinary. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And as I also mentioned earlier, there are more caterpillars, more moth larvae on oaks than on any other plant genus. I think I'm just showing one in this slideshow, but if Doug Tallamy has a great talk, you can find on YouTube, where he talks about just caterpillars on native plants and comparing them with the low diversity on non-native plants, but he goes through a whole bunch of caterpillars that are dependent on oak. But this is another giant silk moth, makes a similar but more egg-shaped cocoon to the Promethea moth I showed earlier. This is the Polyphemus moth. And this is my last plant, and then I'll open it up to whatever other questions people might have. This is a quaking aspen. We have a couple of these that have just popped up in our yard, and I've been mowing around them. One of my all-time favorite leaf miners is Philicnistus populiella. Just this really neat winding mine that can cover the whole leaf surface. The adults are, all Philicnistus species look more or less like this, a little 3mm moth with a dot on the end, but they feed on different plants. This is another micro moth that's specific to the genus Populus. This was a cocoon I found on the underside of a goldenrod leaf, but it was directly under an aspen, so the caterpillar had dropped down to make its cocoon. Just amazing structure. This is the moth emerging from its cocoon. It's in the genus Wachia, and there's a species that Dave Adamski at the Smithsonian, a Mexican species of Wachia that he named Wachia Chewbacca, because Wachia sounds like a Wookiee and also rhymes with Chewbacca. And this is the last species I'll talk about here. It's on both willows and aspens, which are in the same family. It lays this spiky little egg right on the tip of the leaf. When the caterpillar hatches, it starts out by eating on either side of the midrib, and then it attaches all of its frass with silk to the end. So this is where the midrib ends. And then this thing, it's called a frass chain that the caterpillar can go rest on when it's not feeding. And that apparently deters ants, but they don't want to run out on a poop stick to get a caterpillar, so it's safe there. And then in the fall, it starts feeding on the base of the leaf a little bit, and it makes a bed of silk, similar to the way the Spicebush swallowtail made its leaf fold. And then it also wraps silk around the petiole and around the stem, similar to the way the Promethea moth made its leaf shelter. So it stays attached to the twig all winter, and the caterpillar is just hanging out inside there in the dry leaf. This one is actually on a black cherry. It's another butterfly in the same genus. This was the white admiral, but if you see this on a aspen or a willow, that's this other species, which has caterpillars in the spring that get bigger and look like bird poop. The chrysalis looks like bird poop, but the adult looks like a monarch. It's actually a viceroy. It's a very sneaky species. So now we've come full circle, sort of, to the monarch that I started with. And I'm happy to answer any other questions.
Great, thank you so much. That was really extraordinary. So there are some wonderful questions, and I understand if people have to head out, it's, you know, past the original time that we had planned. Please do stay on or check back in. The recording will certainly be available and it will be sent to you. And I'll just say that if you did enjoy this, I encourage you to check out Coastal Rivers Conservation Trust website and also consider becoming a member and supporting this work in Coast Maine. So let's get back to the questions, and I'll try to lump some of them together. There were some really wonderful ones. One person asked, you know, we've had unusually heavy mosquito season this year, and because we're stuck at home, I've been spraying with so-called natural repellents and insecticides, mostly cedar oil. Am I causing excessive harm to non-target insects?
I don't know about those sprays specifically, but generally, if you're spraying, you're killing something, and generally what that ends up doing on the balance is removing predators and parasitoids, so you end up proportionally killing more of the helpful, well, I don't like the word beneficial for insects, but the things that a gardener would consider beneficial end up being killed more, and so you end up with more of a problem than you started with. And some of the leaf mining flies were never really agricultural pests until people started blanketing their crops with pesticides, and then all the parasitoids were killed off, and the flies developed resistance to the pesticide, and so they can be really abundant in some places now. So I've really having just a diversity of native plants and native as natural habitat as you can around you is the best way to have a balanced system where you have things eating each other and nothing. Maybe you'll have little population explosions some years, but then crashes due to parasites and other things, keeping them in check.
That's great. There's lots of great resources now for accessing native plants for your yard and gardens. So we can forward some of those suggestions to you, but also I just recommend people look locally for native plant suppliers, because, for example, you know, we have one specific to this area, but you will have ones that are specific to where you are at as well. Another person was asking, actually very early in your presentation, for the genus name of the poop-covered primrose larva.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry.
That was the weevil larva was Dietzellia, Dietzella. Dietz was this entomologist in around the 1900 or so, and that one was named, the genus was named after him.
And I think it was right around the same time, maybe that same insect in the presentation, somebody else asked, how do they move the frass from one area to another?
Was that asking about that weevil that put it?
I'm guessing it was, but I'm not certain.
Yeah, I didn't actually see that happen, so I'm not totally sure how that little blobby thing was able to, if it just rubbed its back off or what, but like the leaf mining caterpillars that expel their frass from the mines, some of them will just back up and stick their rear end out of the mine, but others will actually pick up the little pellets with their mouth and then move them to one spot and even tie them together with silk so they don't roll around.
Great. Somebody asked if you would talk at all about insects that feed on black swallowwort, which is an invasive species.
Yeah, we have it in our yard and it's impossible to get rid of. There basically aren't any, which is why it's such a problem. I mean, that's why bringing new plants into a continent that's foreign to them is such a bad idea, because they're released from all of the things that kept them in balance where they came from. So not just the insects, but the pathogens that would have controlled them. There's a moth that a lab in Rhode Island is currently working on, wherever swallowwort comes from, is it Europe or Siberia or something? There's this moth caterpillar that feeds on swallowwort that they're doing testing to make sure it doesn't eat anything else, like in the same family, like native things like dogbane or milkweed. So that might eat it, but I don't know of any native insects. I've heard stories of monarchs laying eggs on swallowwort because they can tell it's something related to milkweed, but then the caterpillars die when they try eating it. Yeah, the plants are totally immaculate. I've never found any sign of anything eating swallowwort.
Yeah, it's quite a problem in some places for sure. It's something you don't want to have even get started if at all possible.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see. Another question was, what is the host plant for the clearwing moth?
That particular one, the hummingbird clearwing, is on viburnum, but there's also a snowberry clearwing, which is on, I guess, snowberry, but possibly other, like honeysuckle is closely related to snowberry. And there are other clearwing moths that I'm less familiar with. Yeah, so that specifically was arrowwood viburnum, but there are other viburnums like maple-leaved viburnum and wild raisin and hobblebush that may, those might eat all of those, I'm not sure.
Back to that sort of question about feeder specialists and generalist feeders. Somebody asked, how long might it take for a specialist feeder on invasive plant species to evolve? And would that most likely be from an omnivorous species becoming specialized, or something that already focuses on eating a related genus, expanding into a non-native species?
That's a good question. I probably could go either way, and I have no idea about the time scale. There certainly are native insects that will feed on some of these fairly recently introduced plants. Typically, it's a plant that's in the same genus as its natural, or its normal hosts. So there's one that I find on common buckthorn, Rhamnus cathartica, that was previously, it was feeding on Rhamnus ulnifolia, which is a native wetland buckthorn, which has pretty localized population. So that's a native moth that's actually expanded its range and numbers dramatically because of this introduced plant. It's nice when that happens. But there's a beetle that's kind of specialized on the pea family, Fabaceae, but for whatever reason, it feeds on nettle, on wood nettle, Laportia, and on bittersweet, both the native and the Asian bittersweet. So for each plant that people consider invasive, there's often one or two leaf miners or other insects that will feed on them. There's on Japanese barberry, there's a native moth where there's, in the southeastern US, there's a native barberry, and that inchworm moth, the barberry geometer, has now expanded its range way up to here. You'll see little nibbling on the Japanese barberry. But yeah, I would think it's more, I've heard a lot of permaculture practitioners talk about how there's no such thing as native and non-native plants, and we shouldn't be worried about anything because things will just evolve. But in evolutionary time, you don't generally get a span of 100 years where there are just thousands of new plants and insects and other animals being moved from continent to continent. Or when that does happen, they're usually correlated with mass extinction. So it's not a great thing to be doing, really, but it is what it is.